Aydin Dikerdem is a Labour Party councillor for Wandsworth and a socialist. Before the local elections, Dikerdem pleaded with left-wing voters to support Labour over the Green Party.
If the progressive vote splits, the Tories will win here. They will come back. Wandsworth is not a Labour heartland like Gorton and Denton was. It has only been Labour controlled for the last 4 years. If you're a progressive and you've got progressive values and you believe in the power of municipal socialism like I do, please consider lending us your vote.
I commented and said Labour were not reformable and maybe he should join the Greens. To which he said, "But can you see how in the material reality of where I grew up, my life, my community, that the correct socialist political strategy has been building within the local Labour Party to then win and then deliver real socialist change in policies? Even the fact that we lost by only 15 votes shows why that was the correct path. No?" I then offered Aydin to come on the channel and put his point of view across, that there should be some kind of socialist presence inside the Labour Party. Yesterday, he attempted to do just that. Aydin, thank you so much for joining me today.
No worries at all.
Give me your assessment of Labour's performance at the local election.
Yeah, I mean, personally, very painful. We had been in control of Wandsworth Council. We lost control by 1 seat. We lost that seat by 16 votes. So, personally very painful. And that will be the feeling amongst colleagues across the country where obviously Labour was thrashed, basically. Some of the worst results and some of the worst headwinds, I feel like, as someone who was on the ground campaigning, that I've ever experienced in my nearly 10 years of being a councillor and my longer period of being an activist in the Labour Party. So a very, very difficult set of elections and a difficult night for people who are in the Labour Party.
I mean, your particular win in was it 2018 you first won?
So I was elected in a by-election in 2016 and then we built, it's funny, I've won 3 local elections and only been able to govern for one of them because we win the popular vote, but our seat spread has always not quite made it, apart from in 2022, and that's the first time we'd formed a Labour administration in Wandsworth for 44 years. The Conservatives had dominance in that borough. But, all I can say is that, you fight as hard as you can. And I think Wandsworth was an interesting one because it was really, really close and we didn't see, the Greens didn't make a single win. They didn't get a single councillor. But as someone who's grown up in London, the story of the night was the Greens winning in places that no one ever thought a third party could ever win.
I mean, I remember reading headlines that, even in 2016, 2017, 2018, it was a remarkable win for you. They were saying you're the new young fresh sort of face of the Corbyns kind of Labour, and people thought that was unexpected. I suppose maybe a similar thing's going on with the Greens.
Well, it's an interesting one because as someone who is like on the left and a socialist within the left, the clear thing that I think has often not been picked up by the analysis of the local election results in London is frankly just how many of the victories or strong turnout and wins by Greens in London has been led by former Labour councillors, or often very recent Labour councillors from the left of the party. So as someone who has been fighting for socialist politics within the Labour Party, I think the story in a lot of boroughs is those who, for whatever reason, and often, we can go into the detail of some of it, but have felt so sometimes pressured or bullied or have been deselected to the point at which they have left the Labour Party and run for another party. And I think there's always been a kind of stopgap in the mind of the Labour Party that you can push the left as far as you want because they've got nowhere else to go. And I think that happened actually literally with some Labour councillors, not just members or voters, but with actual elected representatives of the Labour Party. And the story of those election results is in Lewisham, in Southwark, in places where the leader of the council now is literally an ex-Labour councillor. That is a kind of historic break with the way that we have understood how the institution of the Labour Party functions and the calculations it makes when it makes political decisions about who is too left-wing, to be allowed to be a representative. And I think, I think that's something we really, if we are to change the existential threat to the Labour Party, we have to face up to some of those realities and and you know, in some ways have some kind of recompense for the treatment that some people on the left have faced within the Labour Party.
It must be quite interesting with the conversations you're having with ex-Labour councillors who would jump ship to the Greens, especially then to go on to win. Are you basically just saying to them, look, you need to stay and fight, and they're like, we've given up? I mean, what are these conversations like?
So, I mean, I think everyone goes on a different journey, and I can only really speak from my experience in Wandsworth, and it's why I've been such a keen advocate of the Wandsworth project, and it has kind of shaped my own political life, right? Because I just didn't, obviously I've faced the level of pressure as anyone does who is on the left, and I've faced some quite serious and scary pressure at times, but my own Labour group within the council, the leader, Simon Hogg, had my back. And I can't quite imagine how alienating and lonely it would be if they hadn't had my back during some of those battles. And so I can't ever kind of say to someone who has made that decision, like, what's wrong with you? Why weren't you tough? Why didn't you just stick it out? Because in some ways, the culture that we managed to build in Wandsworth is a truly pluralistic culture. And I genuinely think that is possible because we were facing really serious Tories. Like, it's not a safe Labour borough that has been Labour forever, where when that's the case, the power battle is between like which part of the Labour Party, and it's just Labour fighting Labour, right? When you have a real, well-resourced 44-year project fundamentally tied to like the national picture of neoliberalism and Thatcherism, you have a real enemy, and you have a real goal that brings people together. And I think talented people on the left of the Labour Party who, can bring in different members in different parts of the community and like have skills and talents and are like, good on social media or can get out loads of canvassers, becomes a real tool when you're fighting like a proper enemy. And I think in some of those more established Labour strongholds, the internal fights become much more kind of brutal, I guess. And of course, the last 4 years has been the most brutal McCarthyite purges, I think, since like the 1980s, right? So the fact I even feel nervous talking about this highlights some of the pressures and some of the kind of institutional, institutional cultures that have been allowed to develop in the Labour Party. And I don't think the Labour Party will survive this crisis unless it reckons and changes course very quickly. And we can come on to like because I think Gorton and Denton has changed the political map. And I think our literal local election campaigns would drastically change that night in a way that we couldn't have comprehended 8 months ago or a year ago. When we were going into these elections, we were not planning to be fighting a two-fronted campaign against the Greens and the Conservatives. That just wasn't even on our agenda. And so in some ways, I think it is the culmination of that culture that has been allowed to build and develop. And, the watchers of your channel know it intimately. I'm sure that the people who often are so angry at the Labour Party is because they've experienced some of that culture themselves. Maybe they were in the Corbyn movement, when it was happening and got bullied out, or maybe they just watched what happened to the left in the Labour Party over the last, couple of years. And so that anger is really, really tangible. Now, I've come on this show to talk about like, how do we balance that with a coherent socialist strategy to take on reform? But I do think it's worth genuinely recognising, and I think it's important that anyone who wants to change the Labour Party has to be very serious about like the wounds of the last couple of years and what it has meant for like building a coherent left-wing movement, progressive movement that can challenge a far-right government.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, that particularly the Wandsworth Council and the National Party are two different things. Like, I can see your argument in which you've got a tight-knit team, you've got a good team of socialists, you've got each other's back, and I can see why you would advocate for people to vote Labour in your local council. And obviously it's far different to the National Party. But given the fact that you are still part of that party, I think we recognise the party is in crisis. And to me, it doesn't look as though it can make a comeback under its current trajectory, aside from maybe Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister. So what are your thoughts on, we can talk about Makerfield if you want, but what are your thoughts on the prospect of an Andy Burnham becoming Labour leader and then, well, basically Labour Prime Minister?
Yeah, and I think, but just before I jump into that, I think it's important to say that I'm not propagandizing for Wandsworth. In my cabinet, there were moderates, right? But they were moderates who understood the the broad tent politics and mass politics of the Labour movement and the Labour Party. And under first past the post, right, which had been up until now a kind of two-party system, the Labour Party is kind of like this organisation that has lots of people with different strengths of feeling on different issues that broadly coalesce on the left of British politics, right? And I always nick Jeremy Gilbert's line, which is, the dividing line between those who want to dramatically redistribute wealth and power is not between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. It runs through the Labour Party. And so many of I see the Labour Party as a site of struggle. And I've actually, as a young, fiery lefty, you get involved in your local party, you fight your case, you do it in a time when times are good, when, Jeremy was on the ascendancy, and then I stuck around when times were much harder. But you build relationships and you also work out people are complicated, and the factional battles that seem very clear on like Twitter or whatever are just dissolve when they meet the real world of organising and building in your own community. Because you'll have some people who are like rock solid socialists on like council housing or against developers, but like are Gen Xers who obviously had a lovely time like being involved in New Labour and thought it was the best thing ever, and obviously hate like the Iraq War and PFI, and have a useful critique, but still have a kind of attachment to this idea that there is a middle ground. You've got to speak to every kind of voter, and don't drink the Kool-Aid, Aydin, and think that you can just speak to your own people who agree with you. Go out and there are different tendencies and traditions, and you'll meet people who are like really, really like maybe progressive on certain social issues or issues around LGBTQ rights and issues around gender and race, and then actually have quite right-wing economic policies. They fundamentally might have a more kind of liberal economic policy. They're not super excited about nationalisation. So you have these different currents, and that has always been the reality of being in the Labour Party. And I think what's happened is the forever war that took place under Jeremy has given credence, backing, strength to a very tiny minority that are really, really authoritarian, that have a politics that I think is completely out of whack with the mainstream of your average member, who is normally like a public sector worker or like a nurse or a teacher or a retired civil servant, many of whom, in the CLP meetings have been horrified by like the positions on Gaza, by the position on immigration. That you hear it in the CLP meetings, and of course I'm in London, right, which has its own makeup. And so what's happening now, and if we want to talk about Burnham, is I think the fact that we are taking someone out of Westminster to try and get them back in, and that is actually being allowed to happen now, is a symbol of how desperate things have got, and how even those in power recognise the seriousness of the situation. That people, broadly speaking, and this is when I speak to residents on the doorstep, and I speak to members, and I speak to people who are outside the party, they say, look, the only person I think that can beat Nigel Farage is probably someone like Burnham, right? Like a guy who's got a bit of social skills, who's got a bit of charisma, has some, and we can debate the ins and outs of how the impact of it, but has some kind of political delivery record, particularly in Manchester, that he's leaning on at the moment. And so I think it's a moment in which the left's politics are really being kind of proven correct. For those of us who've been saying this is what was happened, it's now happened, and now people are looking for answers. And so I think that the articulation of those of us who have stuck around is kind of, I think it was worth it, because now we're going to have an opportunity to try and articulate a new vision of the Labour Party. And I think everyone, frankly, has worked out that the way things have been going has brought the Labour Party to the precipice, to the reality that it could actually become a smaller party on the left. Like the Greens could surpass the Labour Party if it just continued to ignore, the reality, or ignore the kind of soul and heart and the reason people get up and want to knock doors for the Labour Party. If that's all chucked away and they just continue on the path they're on, you're looking at what happened in France to the Socialist Party, right?
I mean, Burnham is popular, and I completely believe you when people say that, on the doorstep, that Burnham's the guy who could probably beat Nigel Farage. But if we park Burnham's popularity for a second, don't you think that Burnham is kind of a sign of how far Labour have regressed? Because he stood for leadership multiple times, often on a centrist ticket. In 2015, he was seen as the soft left until Jeremy Corbyn came along and blew everyone out of the water. And now we have calls, people inside the Green Party, to back him. And to me, don't you think that's a sign of regression? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was the most left-wing candidate for a long, long time. And now we're sort of going back to Burnham thinking, oh, he's the guy. But actually, he's someone with a very problematic history. We're not quite sure where his politics lies. And at best, he's centre-left. Do you think that's regression?
So I think it depends on what moment in time in history that you're looking at, right? So if you'd have asked me in my mid-20s, the height of Corbynism, like, Aydin, you will be celebrating, in a decade's time, the return of Andy Burnham, I'd be confused. I'd be politically confused, right? Because I'd be looking at a very specific moment in time. I think if we step out further in the kind of like 40-year period of like post-Thatcherism, and, imagine being in your 20s during New Labour and being a socialist on the left and living through Iraq and those issues and feeling like the left is dead. The Mandelson has succeeded. We're in the sealed tomb, we're never to escape. History is over. Actually, the 2008 financial crisis, the kind of return of a left politics, both in Europe, in Britain, what we're seeing in America, people talking about socialism, a socialist mayor of New York. Like, actually, if we step back and think of Corbynism as obviously very painful for those of us who wanted it to succeed, but this absolute from 0 to 1,000 very quickly from that 2015 leadership election, like to the point at which like the establishment are still in a tailspin about it and in kind of perpetual fear of that moment. And the whole it was like carnage. It was like political carnage, wasn't it? And no, the institutions couldn't move fast enough. And of course, those of us who like had agency and wanted it to succeed are kind of always hate the idea of like, were we asking for too much at that time? Were we just naive? And I'd always say, no, absolutely, you got to go for it. You always got to go for it. But if I step back and I think of that, the left coming from kind of nothing to really suddenly having this shot at like a mass politics that was going to form a government, and it didn't work out. And then there was this huge kind of counter-revolution, right? Where like he's literally expelled from the party, and if you don't like it, you can leave, and the entire democracy of the Labour Party is like basically shut down, so you can't even participate in democracy, and the selections are all kind of done without no left candidates even allowed to run. There's a moment of hopelessness, like, oh my God, it was all for nothing. But the left isn't dead, because the left is, and the reality of the conditions and the analysis that we have of the current conjuncture has meant that project that we always knew kind of would fail under its own contradictions has failed. And now we have someone who's returning, and almost everyone is saying, unless there is fundamental change, the same thing will happen. The same kind of cannibalization of his popularity in the polling will just happen. Like, a Labour government gets a massive majority, and then like a year and a half later is like the party's at the existential brink. Those forces still exist, and everyone is saying that the only way to break is a serious break with the status quo. And Andy Burnham is saying that himself. I see it as part of the long trajectory of what the left has been building, and the left's trying to respond to the crisis of the state that is facing us. And so, while things change and different strategic decisions are made, and my hope is that like Burnham, and he says this himself, and I've got to take it at his words, like that Burnham has learnt from being outside of Westminster, like has a genuine love for his community, has a genuine love for like the people of Britain, has a genuine fear of a reform government, has a genuine critique of the Blair period of which he was a part. Like, in some ways, we have to see that as just part of the battle that we've always been having. And in some ways, we're much further than we would have been if we were sitting in 2001, 2003, early 90s. It feels much less hopeless in some ways. It's very fragmented. It's very complicated. We now have a Green Party. We now, the left is in no way unified in a single vehicle, but the forces of the left are having a huge impact on British politics.
I mean, many progressives, left-leaning people, and socialists like myself, we've turned away from Labour, never to look back. You told me on social media that Labour is still a vehicle for socialist change. I know you believe that, but why should other people believe that?
Yeah, I mean, I think about my own area, right? Like using my agency as an individual who's grown up in an area, like what is the process through which I can try and shape outcomes that build socialist power or redistribute wealth in some way or democratize power in the community that I live, right? And in Wandsworth, where you have 44 years of Conservatives and, first past the post and the two-party system, the vehicle was the Labour Party. And I happened to join in really good, exciting conditions of Corbynism, and that certainly shaped my life. I might have not, another time, maybe I wouldn't have done that. But that genuine engagement with that level of kind of mass politics that could actually build a project that brought in lots of people from lots of different traditions within the Labour movement and Labour Party to then be able to run a local authority. I get to build council housing and I get to name it after Shapoorji Saklatvala, and it will be there for 100 years. And working class families who are overcrowded at the moment, I know them personally and I can see them and visit them in their collective asset that is owned by the people of Wandsworth and delivers a rent to the council that can then maintain that building. And that's real, tangible, material stuff. And in some ways, my involvement in politics has always been about trying to deliver real, tangible things, as much as we all love to talk about our ideas and our own personal feelings about the world. I do actually, if it was just what's the purest line, I'd just be on a demo selling papers. Do you know what I mean? I'd feel good about myself, but what am I actually achieving here? Now, it's good to always critique at what point have you crossed the boundary. It's I want to change the system from within or whatever. And at what point does that become almost impossible? And there were certainly times over the last 2 years where that was pushed to its kind of almost breaking point. And, the genocide, right? The genocide in Gaza, for many of us, was the point at which we thought this is, unforgivable behaviour from a Labour Party. Now, Iraq, similar, and Jeremy stuck it out during Iraq, and the Labour left stuck it out during Iraq and articulated for their politics in the Labour Party during Iraq. So I had that as a, as an example of how it is that you do your work, and you don't stay silent. Everyone knows, they saw me. I went on every single demonstration. I helped to coordinate that very early on letter by many councillors who are now in the Green Party who signed up to our ceasefire pledge, the Councillors Against the Siege, which was one of the first breaks with the party line. We were divesting our pension fund. We've been working with the trade unions on that. We've been we're trying to push through, even when we're in opposition now. We're going to try and be balloting our members so that we can actually make a material impact on trying to stop local government pensions being involved in the any company that's complicit in the genocide. And those are difficult things, and you face a lot of institutional pressure from that, and you've got to build the commitment with your communities. And another example in Wandsworth is the peace encampment outside the American Embassy. The American Embassy is based in Wandsworth, and that was on council land. And obviously, in any other council, that they would have just turfed them all out. But we didn't. We defended their right, and we're going to continue to fight and advocate for them. Those are things that, had I not been there and been able to articulate and fight for my politics and build consensus around it, maybe that wouldn't have happened. I don't know. So you try and do what you can to try and have the impact you can in the world. And like I said, people's different contexts are different. So I don't want to speak over or condemn anyone who has made a different call. I do fundamentally, though, believe in a mass politics. And at this moment in time, because the reform threat is so real, I am really worried that the part of the anger at the Labour Party is going to lead to a kind of heart, not head analysis by socialists. There's a famous meme, right? The skeleton I don't want a Labour government. I just want revenge. It's like a skeleton.
Yeah.
You obviously know it. I'm
Yeah, I've
sure your
seen it.
viewers
I've
know it.
felt
Yeah, yeah,
it.
exactly, right. And like, I'm worried that some of left politics has fallen into the trap of that, right? It's like to do with how we feel about the brutal defeats that we've had over the last couple of years, but actually misses some of the opportunities and misses some of the hard graft that needs to be done. Now, I'm not. There's a lot of strategic discussion about this, and a lot of people disagree on this, right? But I come back to, like, Zoran Mamdani ran as a Democrat. The Democratic Party under Joe Biden did more to facilitate the genocide than anyone else in the world, right? And yet that was this decision to articulate and fight for a socialist politics and to use the tools of a mass political, I guess, brand in America, because it's not a party, but something that he knows New Yorkers will actually be able to build enough power behind the Democratic candidacy. We face challenge. We don't have the primary system, right? But there are other ways of negotiating it, and so that for me has always been a guiding principle. Is like measuring how much I can really deliver to make people's lives better by living and delivering on my politics, as well as my own like personal feelings, and always having to navigate that thorny line. And I'm not, look, many people on Twitter and your audience might be furious at this as an argument, but I can only give it as the choices that I've made, right?
Where I'm standing, the difference though with Labour today than under Tony Blair is that, I felt like left wingers were actually kind of safe. Blair was confident in his leadership. He didn't need to purge anyone. To me, that was how Jeremy Corbyn managed to become leader after New Labour. But I don't see the same conditions. The party has been hollowed out. It's not just socialists who've been purged, but soft left MPs have been punished under Starmer. I personally cannot ever see Labour returning to a socialist vehicle or even a mass party that we saw under Corbyn. And socialist councillors like yourself are not only a rare breed, but how is there going to be more of you? I mean, you were first elected under Corbyn's leadership. In terms of the genocide, I mean, I think people on board what I'm saying. Starmer's leadership, his U-turns and his taking money from big corporations was, for me, I'm not going to vote Labour under Keir Starmer, probably not for a long time. And then the genocide was, I'm never going to vote Labour ever again. I know I understand the logic of the argument, which is, well, in 2001, you had Tony Blair as leader. A few years later, we went to war in Iraq. Therefore, don't be despondent when Labour does this again. But for me, that just tells me that Labour won't learn their lesson. We went to war in Iraq. It was an illegal war. Then we had Jeremy Corbyn become leader, thinking, oh, the party is going to change. Even after him, I think we were like, okay, Keir Starmer might be Corbyn in a suit. We may have changed politics forever, even if it's not as radical. But what's happened? A genocide has occurred. So it kind of, rather than looking at Tony Blair and thinking, well, because there was an illegal war, we've bared it before we can bear it again. It just tells me, well, this is always going to happen. And actually, the strategy, because I once sort of believed in maybe stay and fight, but now the strategy is you need to put external pressure. I mean, if we're always going to back Labour, then Labour are never going to want to win our votes. We almost need to punish them. Not as, and I understand the skeleton meme because we all feel it that we want to punish Labour, but I also think as a strategy, someone who's a good socialist, your energy may be better under the Green Party that is facilitated rather than Labour being an energy vacuum for socialists in which you can pass loads of motions, even on national level at conference, and they get ignored. So maybe your energy is actually best placed in a different vehicle.
So, hear that argument a lot. There was one missing bit from your kind of transition from like Blair to Corbynism, right? Which is like Ed Miliband. Okay, so there are different. There are different currents within the Labour Party, and they're important because on the question of like imperialism, right, and the Labour Party's role in international politics, and whether it's going to have a genuinely anti-imperialist outlook, which was probably the most radical part of the Corbyn project, and what scared the establishment so much often was that foreign policy position. Ed Miliband's refusal to on the Syria vote when it came to military intervention is part of that internal battle around different sections of the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and like I say, it being a site of struggle. So it doesn't just lurch from one to another, but there are battles won and battles lost. There are compromises. You know, as someone who has been involved in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of real politics, from the community church hall level, the resident association, up to the big negotiations with developers, and you know, signing off very large capital programs in the hundreds of millions, for me, is a recognition that, like, if you want to be able to do the big stuff, you've got to build a big enough coalition that's going to give you the mandate to do it. And that's why I say we're at a strange precipice, because if everyone is suddenly at 20%, you know, if local election results were horrifying in terms of reform, but it wasn't the huge victory that they'd hoped for, right? So it was, like I said, terrifying, but they've virtue fell slightly. So we might see a leveling out whereby we just have this like five-way split, basically. Poses huge risks, and we can come on to those risks, first past the post electoral system. But when it comes to like, what does that mean for the strategy, and whether we should all jump ship and try something new, or, you know, all I can say is that I think it is worth, and I think it is important, and and it's part of my own personal political project, is not to vacate the space and allow the people that have been trying to get me out of the Labour Party for the last decade to have an easy time of it. They'll love it if I just left, you know, like, because that would legitimize everything that they have probably thought, which was like, you don't really care about the Labour movement or the Labour Party, you know, you're just a parasitical or whatever, you're just an entryist, which I find hilarious, because like I'm the entryist. I'm sorry, the BlackRock and the property lobby that you're welcoming in through the door are the entrysts, right? Like, they had no interest in you when you're in opposition, and suddenly they you know, you want to be hosting dinners for them. I wonder why. Like, you know, that's the battle. And like I say, I come back to that Mamdani point, because I do fundamentally believe in a mass politics. I am very skeptical of the ability of the Greens to build a large enough mass coalition in time, a rigid enough, serious enough structure to deal with the crisis of the state in time, to deal with a reform government. And, you know, this is not to sound shady at all, but like, you know, candidate selection is a challenge for them, you know, because they just don't, they've exploded in membership, and they don't, you know, they don't have I think the necessary tools to deal with the huge forces that are going to be against them in the way that the Labour movement can and does have the capacity to do. People get really annoyed by this one, but the relationship with the trade unions, you know, like I do kind of take Mick Lynch's point that there's a ballast and a strength and an institutional relationship of a 126-year-old political party. Now, the bit that you would have had me on the absolute ropes and that I didn't have an answer for over the last 2 years, and it was a gamble of faith, it was a bid of faith, and it wasn't a leap of faith in some sense. It was like, well, I'll just stick to doing what I can locally, and maybe that's the best I can do. Because I didn't have an intellectual answer to your point about, well, you physically can't rebuild within the Labour Party because it's been so stitched up. There is no internal party democracy anymore. And that was the serious critique. That was the critique that there was no answer for people like me. And we were kind of just going, well, maybe there might be a time, or, you know, we'll just have to see and hold on longer, comrades. And, you know, and everyone's going, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, it's over. You know, it's over. But look at the opening now. I mean, like, the Andy Burnham opening is a drastic change. If Wes can't even get the nominations when the entire PLP has been chosen by, you know, Mandelson and McSweeney, that just shows how fragile this house of cards is built. And so, look, if Andy comes and there is no change, then maybe I'll be proven wrong. But I do think that, given Andy was literally blocked from the Gorton and Denton by-election, he is going to have a stake in rebuilding a culture of fairness and democracy, in how our candidates are selected, and how members are treated, and how internal party democracy works. And we've got to fight for that. And if we win that, then suddenly the Labour Party does become a place in which it's not that big of an ask, but that majority of the member views are represented in the decisions the Labour Party makes. Like that, I mean, like, it's mad that I'm made out to be a radical for thinking that that's a good idea. That the Labour Party shouldn't be this bad faith vehicle which basically cons its members into voting for people who completely change their views 5 minutes later. Like, that is obviously not a sustainable political project. So this current moment is one in which, like, the leap of faith might turn out to have worked. Now we'll have to see, and you might want to come back and say, well, let's see if Andy actually delivers. But at the moment, at the moment the conditions have felt. I'm glad that some of us have stayed in order to try and articulate a politics that can give some ballast to Burnham if he manages to make it.
I mean, because my critique, it's not necessarily the person. There are people who think that the inclusion of Andy Burnham means the party's changing. But my problem is with the Labour machinery, but also the crop of MPs. So my critique is whether Andy Burnham is good or not, whether he wants to govern like he did in Manchester or not. He's got, as you said yourself, hand-picked MPs from Peter Mandelson that might block him. And that's a worry for me. It's the entire machinery. Yes, Andy Burnham was allowed in, but I think they realised it was a bad mistake not to do that, first of all. And I think that was part of protecting Keir Starmer. Now they couldn't not do it. My question, though, is, first of all, when it comes to the Green Party, do you think, I know there are socialists who've joined it, but do you think the party is a socialist party? Do you think it can be a socialist party? And the sort of third part of this question is, why spend so much energy trying to change the Labour Party when it's undemocratic, anti-democratic, and the Greens are democratic? Surely socialists have a better time being inside the Greens, shaping it into a working class socialist party, than it is wondering if you're going to be kicked out. I mean, you were telling me earlier that you almost felt nervous speaking to me today.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, that is the fundamental question that a lot of left wingers are clearly making different choices on, right? Like, because I know that a lot of the people who have joined the Green Party aren't like big lovers of the like old school Green Party, or even have come from the same political tradition as the old school Green Party, or have much in common with your average like long term 20 years Green Party member. They're basically like socialists who want to capture the Green Party and use it as a left wing vehicle. And like that seems to, I mean, I actually don't know loads about the internal cultures of the Green Party. Like, you know, I've had my hands full the last couple of years, you know. But from what I can tell, like it is just like a very obvious, clear kind of project of capturing the Green Party in order to make it a left alternative and changing, and you know, and it doesn't seem to be that difficult relative to like the huge amount of like effort and battles that take place in the Labour Party. I mean, it seems to be kind of like pushing at an open door, and Zach's leadership has transformed the Green Party drastically, with a focus on cost of living, with lots of discussion about international questions like Palestine, and just basically kind of capturing the space that a left-wing party should be in. Like in terms of like the actual effort though, I do worry about the speed in which they can actually, and the speed, the experience, the genuine commitment, because I'm often asked about like, and again, I'm really saying this in good faith. I think I've seen too many people battling with Greens on social media in a kind of tit for tat, and it's not useful. But you know, it's very clear Zach has been on a political journey himself. Like, you know, I've had socialist politics for much longer periods. I think I come from a particular tradition that I'm fully versed in, and there are lots of people who I think are, and that's exciting. We should allow people to have politics that changes, but that is not often offered to Andy, for instance. Like his political journey is kind of seen as like not real, whereas like others might be seen as genuine. So I think there has to be some give and take there. And
well, I mean, just a quick jump on Andy. I think for me, because I agree, I think there should be space for people to change, and I welcome that. In fact, I was all of like that with Andy Burnham when he was Manchester mayor. I was like, I think he's better outside the Westminster bubble. He seems to be far better putting buses into public ownership, things like that. But he has made some some people say U-turns, or has been quite confusing in his politics when he's in the run-up of this election. So I guess for me, it's like, yes, Zach used to be a Lib Dem, absolutely, and it's embarrassing for him, and he would admit that, but he's quite clear in his politics now. I'm still kind of unsure on Andy Burnham. I know this isn't the focus, the entire focus. We're talking about political parties here, but I did want to interject that I still don't really know where Andy stands. I don't think he's as like right-wing as Keir Starmer, but I don't know which Andy Burnham's going to show up, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and I look, I am, I was really, I can't hide like how excited I've been to see that he's being allowed to run. Like, because for me, that if that hadn't happened, I just would have been like, the party's going to die, right? Like, and we have to deal with the repercussions of that, which is, I think, a reform government. Because I think the donor class, I think Reform and the Tories are going to do a deal, right? So I'm genuinely terrified of that. So if the battle is like to make sure that there are like great left-wing people around Andy Burnham talking to him and giving him good ideas, and I know Neil Lawson in Compass is working hard to build that progressive alliance and try and take some of the heat out of these strategic debates. I mean, today I think as of like an hour ago, like Zach Polanski was speaking to what would have been an audience of mostly Labour Party members at the big Compass event. You've got interventions by Gabriel Zucman at the moment, being led by Gary Stevenson, like trying to think through the actual programme. Because I think actually the Greens and the Labour Party both face the challenge of neither having a real programme right now, because the macroeconomic climate that allowed for there to be a very coherent, serious economic manifesto and programme from Corbynism, like what we all understood as like a very realistic, and even people in the Financial Times understood it as a serious prospect, was a decade of low interest rates. Was a different macroeconomic climate, and I don't think the left has really managed to articulate either from Zach Polanski's Greens, and certainly not from the Labour Party, of what a different vision would look like. And I think the name of the game is making sure that Andy has a team around him and is not put under so much pressure that he immediately starts to fold and do what, sadly lots of Labour politicians, I having been in very difficult political decisions around money, around electoral calculus, around, like politics is complicated. It's, people who are online too much need to realise like there's a lot of challenges facing. The crisis of the state is cannibalising prime ministers at a rate we've never seen. What is it like? We're going to have 7 maybe in 7 years or whatever, 6 and 7 years. Like, this is a serious moment. If the name of the game is like, can we get enough good people around Andy Burnham to make sure that project is a real one, then great. I'm glad there's some socialists left in the Labour Party to do that. If we'd all jumped ship, then there would be no space for that opening. So that is the kind of decision-making process. And I do believe in a mass politics, and I don't think the idea that we can. I don't see the Green Party getting enough seats to form a government. And I think that under first past the post is a very serious kind of... I'm trying to couch this in a way that doesn't... Because again, I'm trying not to like piss people off basically, but I do think that is a kind of, you've given up the duty that we have to working class families and people who are struggling in Britain if you're not fighting for a project that is trying to form a government. Because it's, as someone who's been in power and is now back in opposition, I cannot tell you the frustration, the real world damage that is now going to happen to my neighbours, to my community, because we didn't manage to build enough power. And I think that is the great compromise you make when you join a party like the Labour Party or you join a party like the Democrats. But it is also because you want to be able to deliver, and you have to live with that.
I mean, I think a lot of people are not under the illusion that the Greens can form a next government, but I think their target is to have a big chunk in Parliament. Do you think the Greens and their surge is temporary? Or do you think it's real and they're going to have a big impact in the next election? Like, say Andy Burnham wins the by-election, he becomes Labour Prime Minister. Do you think that takes a lot of energy out of the Green Party's sails? And, they are on 230,000 members. They could overtake Labour in terms of numbers. Do you think it's only because that Labour have been so alienated to people, people jump to the Greens, and Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister kind of regresses the Greens a bit? Or do you think, even with the inclusion of Andy Burnham, the Greens are still a long-term force?
Firstly, the way that I'm thinking and analysing in the world is in some ways like less about like which political party is going to benefit the most and more about like how are we going to defeat the Tories and Reform from coming back. So those are my kind of first principles. And I realistically think the Labour Party is the institutionally stronger party. Now, if it made a series of catastrophic decisions, it could have destroyed itself, but I think it might not do that now. We'll have to see. I do think Andy Burnham can only turn things around if he, like I just said, genuinely builds a alternative and a program that can deliver to tackle the crisis of the state, the same crisis that is facing Starmer and Reeves, right? Like that is what will define what happens in this country. And I guess the Green Party needs to decide whether the Green Party is interested in the long-term survival of the Green Party and the building of the Green Party and the success of the Green Party as a political project, or it's willing to think of itself as part of a larger popular front against rising forces of the far right. I genuinely think the biggest problem we have is that the Green Party's success and strength is basically at the moment predicated on a lot of people who desperately want to destroy the Labour Party. And so, like, are we setting ourselves up for failure? That what Neil Lawson and Compass and all these people want to achieve is just like fundamentally not possible because it's a zero-sum game between those two political organisations. And what then the kind of like moral green position would be to like understand that your job is to put pressure on the Labour Party rather than like try and build your own. And like loads of people rightly are like, I literally, that's not my project. My project is not to be seen as like this, to not be the main character of my own story, to just be someone whose job is to like steer the main character, which is the Labour Party. That isn't the project I'm building. I want to build an alternative and different project. And I think that is the fundamental challenge and contradiction that faces socialists at the moment. And it's kind of why I'm on your show, because I think it's important that the like articulation of why some people haven't jumped who are on the left is as an important one. Like I say, like people like Mamdani are genuinely the most exciting things that give me hope in politics at the moment, and they seem to have followed that more mass political strategy and not run as third candidates or not run as under a kind of Jill Stein green conditions. So that is really the kind of alternative I want to articulate. But I'm not hiding from the fact that there are some serious challenges ahead, and I think it's going to be complicated. When you speak to people who are not hardcore politicos, who are not hardcore activists, they have much less skin in the game. They're much less kind of like tribalistic in that way. So like, I think a lot of people broadly had the Caroline Lucas position. Like, why are the Greens running against Andy? That doesn't make any sense. Like, that was the kind of, hardcore politicos were like, we must do this because that's the only way we can leverage pressure and da 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 da. But like normal people were kind of like, guys, don't do this. Please don't do this. Like, it's kind of the same when like Jeremy and Zara were fighting. Like, your normal person was like, why are you doing this? Like, the left should be together. Like most people broadly support a popular front because most people understand that there should be a mass politics and like we need to create that mass political vehicle. So like in some ways, like that position is closer to the every person on the street, but it's just going to be really hard to navigate. And so, that is an obvious critique of my position, but it's one again where it's worth having socialists who are trying to make sure that if Andy does make it, that the Labour Party is genuinely trying to offer a transformative, different, the change that it was elected on before the next election, because otherwise we're going to get some really serious dark money, dangerous authoritarian politics arriving in Britain. But again, that's how I first picked up on your show, is like you're one of the few people that is pointing out the like American dark money international angle to what is happening in Britain, which I think is kind of lost on lots of people, and something that is like you know, worth me being called a sellout on Twitter is fighting that, you know, in the Labour Party. I'm up for it, you know.
Aydin, thank you so much for speaking to me. You've demonstrated there are some socialists still left in the Labour Party, so I appreciate you coming on Turn Left.
Really, really glad to be here, and yeah, it's always good to have frank and forthright discussions with comrades.